Finish out this section on widows tonight that we have been dealing with. One of the tragic realities of history is evidenced in how women have been treated at various times and by various groups, including religious organizations. For example, Martin Luther and John Calvin, way back in the 16th century, these two individuals are most known for being instrumental in the Protestant Reformation. They were battling the teaching of the Catholic Church that women were unclean pawns of the devil who lured men to sins of lust. That was how the Roman Catholic Church viewed them. Great progress was made throughout the upcoming centuries that sought to provide an equality to women that would include such things as the ability, for example, to be educated along with boys. The ability to vote was another issue, and even by the turn of the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, even the potential of being able to hold political office. Progress slowed significantly, interestingly, during the Great Depression. It was viewed as though women were taking jobs from men, and so they were not permitted into the workplace. Of course, then World War II comes around and necessitated that women join the workplace to support those who are now fighting for freedom. Interestingly, right after that was still a renewed emphasis on a wife, a mother being at home, and so forth. In the 1960s, there was a lot in that time period in which our country changed, and changed in many ways very adversely. And there was a rise of, among other things, radical feminism. And this is not the same as the idea of saying that women should have the right to be educated, okay? Radical feminism is a form of feminism that vastly differs from what we have mentioned as far as a push for women's rights. They are a group of right activists, and this is a definition of them, who see all men as oppressors and wish to exclude them altogether. And you find this ideology today, and their hostility is reflected, for example, in their manifesto, which formed an acronym SCUM, Society for the Cutting Up of Men. That's how it was viewed. The lesbianism would be the ultimate thrust of radical feminism because it would insist that men are completely irrelevant. And interestingly, that the radical teaching of feminism was not adopted by many who sought to bring about an awareness of women's rights. There's a difference there. And I think sometimes we think, well, women's rights, and we automatically associate it with the radical feminism. Well, that's not the case. There were good groups that have made some great advancements in things. I don't think anybody here has a problem with women being educated, okay? Women having the right to vote, things like that. These are not problems, okay? The radical feminism, however, is a significant problem that has very adversely affected our culture even today. We still are witnessing its effects. And with everything in life, there's a point where we come back to the Bible and we say, okay, what's the biblical balance? Because we have to avoid these kinds of extremes. The Bible clearly teaches that male and female were created by God, and they were created in the image of God. Both of them were were appointed to rule over creation. Men don't occupy a higher status in the mind of God than women. It's fair to say in this forum that women are equal in status, that one is not elevated more than another. Men and women are not to be regarded as superior and inferior in their status to one another. But the Bible is also equally clear that male and female occupy unique functions. It's fitting and proper to recognize equal privileges, as we've already mentioned, but it is equally fitting and proper to recognize God has made men and women differently. Okay? Every married couple should attest to this reality. Men and women are made differently. They have been designed by God to fulfill a unique role. does not mean that one is better than the other. It is a reality that embraces God's design, and it recognizes distinctions that have to be maintained. Men and women are equal in status, but they are unique in role. Okay? And you find teaching in certain passages, even in Paul's writings in 1 Timothy. We've already seen one in chapter 2 that talked about the women learning in silence in the church. That is an offensive passage to some females today. Here's another one that we come across tonight in 1 Timothy 5, notice verse 14. Paul says, I will therefore that younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Great. Paul's just saying women are to walk around barefoot and pregnant all their lives. Stay in the kitchen where they belong. That's not Paul's teaching at all. But there are some who will read that passage right there and will bristle with resentment over what seems to be almost male chauvinism, where Paul is prohibiting women from doing anything outside the home. That is not Paul's message at all. As we've worked our way through 1 Timothy 5, we've seen the importance of maintaining godly relationships. And we're into a section where we are looking at the relationship toward the widows. We've already seen the need to assess the need with discernment in verses 3 through 8. We saw the importance of assisting the qualified with compassion in verses 9 and 10. To reject the disqualified with consistency in verses 5 and verses 11 through 13. And tonight we want to look at this point. Affirm God's plan with boldness, verses 14 through 16. God has a plan, and Paul is very clear to describe that plan for us, but I would say, just as it would have in 1 Timothy 5, when Paul was writing this, taken boldness to affirm that kind of a plan, I would say that today it would as well, because this is by no means going to be the popular idea. Paul begins with these words, I will therefore. It suggests a deliberate and a thoughtful solution to very ungodly behavior that we described in our previous message in verses 11 through 13. There were women younger widows who were to be refused because on the basis of two things. One was they would have a natural desire to go and to marry, and in doing so would abandon a pledge that they had made, most likely a pledge that would suggest they would devote their lives in service to the Lord. Don't put them in this spot, says Paul. Another reason was they would have a tendency with too much idle time on their hands to go about and become gossips and become engaged in meddlesome activity where they're engaged in business that does not belong to them. There's a better option than this. There's a better way of going about than functioning that way. And so Paul didn't just sit down and write and come up with some sort of a whimsical plan. Instead, Paul sits down and deliberately, after much thought, says, okay, here is what I intend to happen. And in doing so, what we find in verses 14 and 15, that God's plan is expressed now for the younger widows. What do we do with these younger widows? We were already told to reject them back in verse number 11. We were to not put them on any kind of list of financial assistance. Maybe it seems cruel, but Paul gave very valid reasons as to why. So what are they to do? And keep it in mind the context of what we're dealing with. This is providing guidance in order for the church to know who do we take care of, who do we not take care of. A widow who had no outside sources for support had to satisfy certain qualifications of age, marital devotion, a testimony of faithful service. All of this is stuff that we've already seen. Younger widows, as I've already mentioned, were to be refused. So what are they to do? Number one, remarry. He says, I will therefore that the younger women marry. There are some who may advocate that remarriage is never permitted under any circumstance, but the Bible teaches differently. And certainly in some cases, remarriage is valid, including after death. Romans chapter 7, verse number 3. So then if while her husband liveth she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But notice the continuation of that verse. If her husband be dead, she's free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. A little bit later on, Paul, in writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, observed that the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Here's the qualification. Now, Paul does not state here in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that to remarry in the Lord, but you can understand certainly that's within Paul's expectation. Okay? The qualification is you are to remarry, but you're to do so in the Lord. Secondly, they were to bear children. Now, we run into an issue today because obviously it would say if they have the ability to bear children, they're still in childbearing years, but it's interesting to note how God views motherhood and how culture views motherhood. The Bible exalts motherhood. God honors it and God exalts it. One example of that is just found in Proverbs chapter 31, the well-known passage of Scripture regarding the virtuous woman. In fact, women, the motherhood is held up as the woman's highest calling and privilege. In Titus chapter 2, Paul recognized the importance of the older women teaching the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. Culture, on the other hand, has been permitted to portray motherhood in a very negative light, even among believers. Some view children as a hindrance. They strap me down, and I can't do whatever it is that I want to do, whether that be the pursuit of a career or whether that be something that you just simply desire. In fact, our culture says children are to actually be avoided, even if it means to abort them. Isn't it interesting? That's not God's take on it. Radical feminism has undermined the teaching of the Bible by encouraging women to forsake the home and find self-fulfillment outside the home. There's a problem with that. Now, at times, a second job may be necessary. I'm not saying that a working wife and mother is out of God's will. But I will say this, God never condones the sacrifice of children on the altar of a personal career. God does not permit that, okay? There are times when necessities take place, but for a mother, we don't just abandon the children just so that we can pursue a career. Don't allow culture to define your values as believers. Bear children. Third point, manage the household. The statement is actually guide the house. The word, the phrase would suggest that of managing a household. Wives, mothers, play a vital role in managing the household to keep it, and the implication is, in good order. Now, who is ultimately responsible for the guidance and the direction of the entire household? The father, the husband, the father. He is the one, like it or not, that has been put over the home. It doesn't mean that he is able to abuse that authority or anything like that, but it still is a position, in spite of the abuse of some, it still is a position that God has appointed. He is ultimately the one responsible for what goes on in that home. However, practically, it is the mother who oftentimes administrates and directs the home on a daily basis. In fact, she's the one that often influences the children more significantly than the father. Now, it is vital, obviously, that the two be on the same page. It's a whole other message in and of itself. If you've got one husband who's teaching this and a mother who is undermining everything throughout the day, you're going to have disaster within that home. But she is to be responsible to manage this household. Now, if she were to do everything that Paul has just said, she would be so consumed with her time, she's not going to have idle time to go around and gossip. She's not going to have idle time to get involved as a busybody in verse 13, someone who's engaged in meddlesome activity. Those of you who have raised children, moms, that's harder work than going out to a factory. You talk about time consuming. You don't have time to use the restroom, let alone do anything else. Okay? That's child rearing. And it is a noble privilege, and it is an amazing opportunity for moms to realize the value that's there. Rather than going about doing all of this harmful activity, Paul says, be engaged in this kind of activity because this is what is ultimately going to be beneficial. The fourth thing that Paul desires is that they avoid creating opportunities for slander. Here's the statement: give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. This phrase, give none occasion, and an occasion would suggest an opportunity, an excuse, maybe even an incentive. We use the term adversary, and immediately we might think of Satan, but the text does not limit it to Satan. This would include anybody who is in opposition. Satan, incidentally, uses individuals to spread slander. Can I caution you to avoid being one of his tools? What a thought. Of adversaries, those who are in opposition look for opportunities to speak reproachfully. They're looking for it. Don't give them a chance. This speak reproachfully, hurl verbal abuse or slander. Don't give them that opportunity. Let's just deviate just very briefly. As believers, this is not just women. Realize that the manner in which you choose to live may actually provide an excuse for someone else to slander. Is it important how you choose to live day in and day out? Absolutely. Let me ask you this. Can you stop slander? Nope. Good luck trying. Okay? If your concept is that you can live a godly life and everyone is going to speak favorably of you to everyone they encounter, I hate to break this to you, that's not going to happen. You can't stop slander. You can't stop people from saying things that are insulting, saying things that we might even say are verbally abusive. You can't stop it, but here's what you can do. You can live in such a way that what they say is proven to be false. That's how we ought to conduct our lives. I can't stop him from running his mouth. I can't stop him from saying whatever it is he's bound to say. But I can live my life in such a way so that everyone who hears that knows that's not true. These younger widows who engaged in the behavior described in verses 11 through 13 actually, by their actions, whether it was intentional or not, I can't tell, but by their actions, they actually evoked opportunities for slander. And Paul says don't do that. Live a godly life so that you're able to ensure that you have a godly testimony. Here's the reasoning as to why he says this in verse 15. For some are already turned aside after Satan. Some, obviously an indefinite number. It's more than one, we know that, but we don't know how many. It's an indefinite number, but let me add to this, it is a verifiable group. Paul doesn't mention people by name, but he's not talking about a hypothetical group out there that may or may not exist. There is this group that's out there. How many? We don't know. Who? We don't know. But we do know that it was more than one. It's a plural word. So more than one people are out there, and they have already, at this point in time, they have already been caused to turn aside after Satan. It's interesting that some will say this means they're guilty of abandoning Christianity. That's a possibility, but I don't think that that's it within the context of this, because it certainly seems as though what we're dealing with is godly ladies, and so I don't see that they're abandoning Christianity. It does, however, seem better to understand it as suggesting they were unknowingly being led by Satan, which was evidenced in their ungodly behavior. What do? Well, they stopped trusting in God and they began to engage in a carnal lifestyle. Whether or not they knew it, they were actually no longer following Christ, but they were following Satan. Let me ask you, who does a carnal believer follow? In reality, it's Satan. It's not Christ. It's a thought that perhaps we don't consider a whole lot. So he says, expresses God's plan for younger widows. Well, then we find in verse number 16, as we finish this passage out, God's plan is expressed for the care of widows. Notice what the Bible says. If any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. In essence, Paul is concluding his teaching and in many ways restating what he has already taught earlier. There's a conditional statement. If any man or woman that believeth have widows. It's a condition that is assumed to be true for sake of discussion. So let's say it this way. Assuming that a Christian, whether he be a male or a female, has a widow as a family member. Now, previously, we talked about directly children and grandchildren, but let's just say that it's somebody within the family and there is a widow that's there. That's the condition that Paul is assuming. They are commanded to let them relieve them. They are commanded to come to their aid and help them. It's interesting that the first responsibility does not belong to the church. I don't know how many times I have declined someone's financial assistance to then be blasted with all sorts of colorful language, to which I would often simply tell them, generally interrupting them, you are confirming why I'm not going to do this. And then I'll let them continue. In that process, it inevitably comes out something along the lines of either you claim to be a pastor or you all claim to be a church. And the mindset is, it is the church's responsibility to provide for my needs. Let me tell you, that is an unbiblical attitude. It is the individual's responsibility to provide for his needs. If he is incapable, it is the family's responsibility to help. If there is no family and there are no opportunities and this person has met these qualifications, then it falls to the church. There's a long process before it ever falls to the church. However, weekly, especially around Christmas time, it is amazing how many phone calls we get trying to purchase someone's Christmas presents. This is a very, very common occurrence. Let me point out a couple of things with this. Let not the church be charged before I bring this up. Suggests that they were being charged, they were becoming financially burdened, and this needs to stop. All right, let me bring three things. Number one, the church can become overly burdened with individual expectation that does not first assume personal responsibility. I want you to ponder that statement. The church can become overly burdened with individual expectation that does not first assume personal responsibility. I will say that this, as a principle, can get applied in a lot of ways. Oftentimes, people in their own minds, intentional, not intentional, well-intentioned, not well-intentioned, I don't know the motives, but I often have heard the words, you need to do. I need to do. You need to do. You need to do. Here's the problem. If Mike says you need to do something, and my father says you need to do something, and Roy says you need to do something, and Dale says you need to do something, and Cecil says you need to do something, my wife says you need to do something, who am I going to listen to? My wife. No, I'm teasing, okay? She's going to throw something at me, and I'm not going to have a chance to duck. But anyway, what's the problem? All individual expectations. You need to meet my family members' needs. That's what's going on here. You have a responsibility to meet the needs of my widow. And Paul says, no, they have family. If there's family in there, do not stop allowing, actually, the church to become financially burdened by these people. It is possible for a church to become governed by individual expectations. That's not a healthy thing. We're not in this individually. We are in this ministry in a united front, and we are to take on the ministry that God has called us to do as a united body of believers, not as individuals fulfilling their own preferences. You run into problems there. Number two, Personal expectations can become distracting to the leaders of a church and not permit them to fulfill their calling. What happened in Acts chapter 6? Do you remember there were widows who were neglected? Here, once again, we come to the widows. It's nothing against the widows, but there were some that were neglected, the Bible says, in the daily ministration. Now, it was a legitimate problem. The apostles recognized that it was not fitting for them to serve these financial tables. They chose the deacons. Why? So that they could give themselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. They recognized that personal expectations could even deter them from leading and fulfilling their ministry. The reason that Paul says all of this is not to be ugly, but is instead to enable the church to fulfill its ministry. He says, if any man or woman that believeth have widows. So if you have a believing male or a believing female, and they have widows within their own family, let them, the family members, relieve them, come to their aid, and stop letting the church be charged, be financially burdened. Here's why. That it may relieve them that are widows indeed. My third point is this: a church unnecessarily burdened with expectation is limited in its ability to minister. Don't do this. Because in all reality, there is a ministry that you're going to not be able to do. Satan would love for nothing more than to distract any body of believers from fulfilling its ministry. Paul's instruction for individuals to assume personal responsibility is designed to enable the church to truly engage in ministry to the widows who are truly in need. We've seen that phrase 3 times, widows indeed, in this section, beginning in verse 3 down through verse 16. There are those who are truly in need, and there are those who just think they are in need. There are those that you're going to support. There are those you are going to have to refuse. Why? So that you stay focused on fulfilling the ministry that God's called you to fulfill. So that you are able to help those that are truly in need. Let me say, as individuals as well as an organization, in order for us to remain focused, we all have to avoid things that distract us from fulfilling God's calling on our lives, even if it seems good or beneficial. On the surface, it would seem good to help all the widows, right? This is a good thing. But Paul says, actually there's a lot of danger with helping some of these. Sometimes we engage in good behavior or behavior that we perceive to be beneficial. The better question to ask, is this what God would have me do? Stay focused. Satan can sidetrack us so easily and so quickly. Let's not let that happen. Let's determine that we'll stay focused so that we can fulfill whatever God's calling is for this ministry, that it can make the impact that God has intended for it to make.